Introduction to neuroanatomy. We're going to take a quick tour of the brain, go over the big landmarks, the structure and organization of the brain. But first, we're going to start out with some terminology. We're going to start out with some terminology so that you know what I'm talking about when I say that something's anterior or if it's medial. Also, we'll go through the structure of the nervous system. The nervous system describes all of the nervous system in the body. You can break it down into the central and the peripheral, and then you can go further than that. I'll also spend most of the time talking about the central nervous system and then a smaller amount of time talking about the peripheral nervous system. They're both very important. The one that we probably focus most attention on is the central, so that will be the primary focus of this lecture as well. Okay, so let's get started. First, we need to talk about where things are and the terminology that we use to describe structures in the brain, not only, and in the nervous system, not only where they are located themselves, but where they are located relative to other structures. And the first thing we need to do is we need to think about in your mind, or you can watch this on the screen, there is this line, this imaginary line that goes from the center of the forehead. Now we're going to work with a quadruped here because this is where it was originally designed. It goes through the center of the forehead into the middle, the exact middle of the body, all the way through, and then exits through the tail. This is called the neuraxis. The neuraxis enters through the center of the forehead and then exits through the tail. When we think about the neuraxis as far as where things are, it simplifies things because anything that's located above the neuraxis we can say is dorsal. Anything that's located below the neuraxis is ventral. Anything located near the beginning or the front end of the neuraxis is rostral or anterior, and anything located near the back end of the neuraxis is posterior or caudal. Okay, so that's the first thing. But then it becomes more complicated because we don't walk on four legs. We walk on two. So you have to take this creature here and the neuraxis that goes along with it and then make it upright. And when you do that, what you see is that, again, you have the neuraxis. It starts in the middle of the forehead and it goes exactly through the middle of the body. But then since we walk upright, right about the middle of the brain, it takes a 90-degree turn and starts going straight down. So it's pretty much very similar for the two-legged versus the four-legged, except that when we're talking about different structures in the brain, we may be talking about the occipital lobe, which is located here in the back of the brain, but we're still going to refer to it as dorsally located because, see, it's still on the top side of the neuraxis. Okay, whereas it's a little bit different in terms of a four-legged creature versus a two-legged creature. And it also confuses some of the terminology here because dorsal we know is anything towards the back and ventral is anything towards the belly. But when we talk about humans, now ventral is here in the front because it's still on the belly. Okay, it's below the neuraxis, whereas dorsal, it's still towards the back, but now it's not exactly on the top. Okay, hopefully that will make sense. If you just think about that neuraxis and how it differs for quadrupeds versus bipeds, like we humans. Okay, the two first descriptors or terms are anterior, that's located near the head, and posterior, that's located near the tail. Now, when we talk about humans, the posterior then actually extends towards the feet. Anterior is the same, posterior includes anything towards the feet, the tail and the feet. Okay, dorsal, I mentioned that, anything towards the back. Okay, and so it usually means up above too as well, but for humans, towards the back is not necessarily up above all the time. Sometimes it's just towards the back. Ventral is the same thing. You can see how it differs. Ventral here looks like it's below, right? Because it's below, if we were describing maybe the thalamus right here, it's ventrally located because it's below the neuraxis, but also the belly is located ventrally as well. So just keep those terms in mind and how they differ a little bit for animals or creatures with four legs and creatures with two. Okay, the next one is superior, and that is really a synonym with dorsal. So superior and then inferior, which is a synonym with ventral, you can use those interchangeably. Okay, if we're trying to decide or describe a structure that is located more towards the center of the body versus one more located towards the side of the body or away from the neuraxis, then we would use these terms. Lateral describes anything that is located more distally or away from the neuraxis. Here's the neuraxis here. Remember this little red line? Anything that's located away from the neuraxis is more lateral. Anything that's located more close to the neuraxis is more medial. And we use these terms when we're describing the relative location of two structures. So I'll just use structures in the face as an example. When we want to describe where our eyes are, what we could say is that our eyes are more lateral than our nose, because our nose is closer to the midline of the body. Whereas if we were going to talk about our eyes in relation to our ears are more medial to our ears. Right? So they are terms that are used relatively when you're trying to describe where a structure is in relation to another structure. Okay, so here's a little animation that shows you medial structures are located more towards the midline or the neuraxis, whereas lateral structures are located more towards or more away from the neuraxis or towards the side of the body. Okay, also, we need to be able to figure out or describe structures that are located on the same side of the body, two structures that are on the same side versus structures that are on opposite sides. If we're talking about two structures that are located on the same side of the body, then we could use the word ipsilateral. Ipsilateral describes two structures that are located on the same side. So my left eye and my left ear are ipsilaterally located, or they're ipsilateral to each other. Now, when we're talking about structures that are located on two structures that are on opposite sides of the body, then we would use the term contralateral because they are located on opposite sides of the body. So my right eye is contralateral to my left nostril, for example, because they're located on opposite sides of the body. Why is this important to know? Well, because when we're talking about how our peripheral nervous system and our central nervous system how they work together, one of the really interesting things that you'll find out if you don't already know is that you would think that the left side of the brain would control the left side of the body, but it doesn't. Actually, the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. So what we would say is that the brain, the part of the brain that is involved in controlling movement for the left side of the body, the right hemisphere, is contralateral to the body or the side of the body that it controls. Now, why does this happen? It's believed that during early neural development, we won't go into this in this class, but during early neural development, when the neural tube is forming the basis of our nervous system, at some point, the neural tube takes a 180-degree turn. And so what ends up happening is that although the left side of the brain, or the left hemisphere of the brain, was originally going to control the left side of the body, that turn in the development causes that contralateral wiring or setup, organization of the brain and the part of the body or the side of the body that it controls. Okay, so ipsilateral, same side of the body. Contralateral are opposite sides of the body. The next thing I want to talk about is planes of view or slices of brain tissue. We will be looking at many of those as we go through the semester. And so I want you to have a good understanding of what we're looking at. If somebody says this is a sagittal plane or a sagittal view of the brain, then I want you to understand or recognize that what that means is that you're looking at a side view. Sagittal view is a side view. This is an example of the inner of the part of the brain where we're looking at the inside. And here's an example of a sagittal view when we're looking from the outside. Both of these are sagittal views because the thing that makes a sagittal plane or a sagittal view sagittal is that you're looking at a half, looking at a complete slice of the side of the brain. So let me go through these. The first one is the horizontal plane. That's pretty easy, right? It's just a plane or a slice of brain that is parallel to the floor. So the horizontal plane is this plane here. If we took a little slice of brain out, what it would look like is it would look something like this, where we have it looks like a slice of brain, and we've got the front here, and we've got the back of the brain here, and you can see it's a horizontal plane. Okay, the next one is the one I was just talking about, and that is the sagittal plane. And the sagittal plane is where you're taking it's a view of the side of the brain, or a slice, a complete slice of the brain from the front to the back here, where you're taking a slide. It's a slice of the brain in the vertical plane. So this is a horizontal plane. This is a vertical plane. And then the last one is the transverse. And the transverse is sometimes called a coronal plane or a coronal cut. And if you think about it, cutting, a roll of salami, when you slice up that salami into the little round circles, you're creating transverse cuts or transverse plane, or slices that are in a transverse plane. So here's the transverse plane. If you were to cut it like a salami, that's kind of gross, but you would end up with cuts that look kind of like this, where we have a slice of salami brain, where we have the dorsal part, the top of the brain, and the ventral part, and then we have the left and the right hemispheres here. So a transverse plane actually is a cut that divides the front from the back, and the slice looks sort of like this. Okay, so it's important to remember those, because when we look at slices of brain tissue, you'll need to be able to orient where that plane is in your brain, or in the brain that you're looking at. Here's an example of a horizontal slice, or a horizontal view. So this is, it's as if we were looking down. Someone just cut the top of the brain off. And actually, here's the skull. So they've cut the top of the skull off with the brain. And here's the front, and here's the back. And here is well, actually, it's reversed, right and left. This is often what happens when you're looking at imaging. But you can see it's a horizontal plane. And we'll go through these different lobes in a slide coming up. Here's an example of a sagittal view, or if this were a slice, it would be a sagittal plane. Now, which hemisphere of the brain are we looking at here? The left or the right? Here is how you can figure out which hemisphere you're looking at. First thing you have to do is find the cerebellum. It's this little structure here. It literally means little brain. Once you find the cerebellum, then you know, oh, that's the back of the brain. So then this must be the front of the brain. And if that's the back and this is the front and this is the center, then we know we're looking at the left hemisphere. So when you're trying to figure out which hemisphere you're looking for or looking at, find the cerebellum, and that will give you an idea of where it is or what you're looking at. Now, a sagittal section or sagittal view can either be, it shows the entire side of the brain. It could be from the inside. It could be a view like this, where you're looking at the outside, but this is a sagittal view. Okay, now let's look at this last one. This is a transverse section. The transverse section is like if you took a slice out just like this square. What you'd have, these are the salami cuts, remember, and this is also called a coronal plane, but you'd end up with a slice of brain where you have the top, the dorsal part of the brain, and the ventral part of the brain. We would have the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, depending on which way it's oriented. And then you'll see things like these little gaps or these little holes. These are actually the lateral ventricles. I'll talk about those in a few minutes. But what's really cool about this transverse cut is that you can also see the gray and white matter in the brain. So we see that, the little bumps in the valleys, the ridges in the valleys that we know as gyri and sulci. I'll talk about those in a few minutes. But we can also see inside the cortex here, you can see what's called white matter and gray matter. Gray matter, as I'll mention in a few minutes, is the neuron's cell bodies, and the white matter, that's the way the neuron communicates information, and it's white matter because the part of the neuron, the axon, that communicates information is insulated with this sort of fatty tissue called myelin. And so when you have a bunch of those axons together that have that myelin tissue covering them, it makes it seem white in appearance. And that's how you know these are the axons and these are the neural cell bodies here. Okay, but this is an example again of a transverse cut or transverse plane, also known as a coronal. Okay, we're looking at a horizontal view now, right? Because this is the top of the brain. And with this, you can see, just like in the last slide, you can see the differences between the different parts of the cortex. So this entire part here is the cortex. And you don't typically see a brain that has all the vascularity or the blood supply attached to it, because usually when we're looking at brain, they've removed that. But here is a good view. You can see just how much blood supply the brain gets. It needs a lot. If neurons in the brain are deprived of oxygen or sugar for more than 4 minutes, then they start to shut down. They start to die. There's lots of ways you can kill neurons, and that's one of them. So blood supply is important. Okay, so, but what I wanted to refer to on this one is, again, you can see the gray matter. Now, gray matter, it's kind of pinkish gray in the fresh brain here. The gray matter is all of the cortex that you can see, all of these little gyri and the ridges and the little sulci, the little valleys. When you take a cut out, you can see that they took a little slice out here. Then what you end up seeing is not only the gray matter, which is the neuron cell bodies, but you also see the white matter too. And those are the axons that send the messages. So you can see the brain is composed, or it's the structure of the brain is such that all of the neuron cell bodies form this outer layer of cortex, and they send their wiring into the middle of the brain or towards the center of the brain. They send it medially to communicate whatever the neurons are trying to communicate to the structures in the middle of the brain. One of those structures is the corpus callosum, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But gray matter, that's neuron cell bodies. And also, because the neuron cell body and all of its little extensions, we call those dendrites, because the early neuroanatomists thought that they looked a lot like branches, tree branches, and that's what the word dendrite means. But the neuron cell bodies, the gray matter contains, or it's made up of those cell bodies and the little extensions from the cell body, which are dendrites. Whereas the white matter, that's all of the axons that are myelinated, with that fatty sort of lipid insulation to help make sure that message gets sent as fast as possible. You can see the white matter on the inside here. Now, every neuron only has one axon, but there can be many, many dendrites. We'll talk a lot about that next time. Okay, so we know that the brain is composed of neurons, okay, with their cell bodies and their axons, but the other type of neural cell that the brain is composed of is glia, or glial cells. And it was once thought that glial cells only provided a structure, like a scaffolding for neurons in the brain. But actually, we know more than that now. We know that just in the last 10 years, glia play a much greater role. In fact, we know they're involved in communication between neurons. They do more than just provide a structure and like scaffolding for the neurons. Sometimes they even help to reabsorb neurotransmitters. We know that they also play a role in feeding sugar and oxygen to neurons. So they play a supportive role, but we know also now that they play also a role in communication between neurons. If we think about the number of these cells, these neurons in the brain and these glial cells, anybody know how many neurons are currently believed to make up the human brain?
86 billion?
Good. Yeah, right around 85, 86 billion neurons. And each of those neurons can be connected up to 10,000 times with other neurons, which is mind-boggling, pun intended. But even with those 86 billion neurons, we know that that is only 10% of the neural cells that you find in the brain, because the other 90, whatever, 900, whatever, the other 90%, that's what I was looking for, of cells are glial cells. So they vastly outnumber the number of neurons. So you can imagine how many there are, quite a few, and they play a very important role in supporting the neurons that we have. Okay. Let me just show you the structure of the nervous system really quickly. The nervous system itself describes everything, all of the neurons and all of the structures that make up the nervous system. But you can divide it into two main parts, and that is the central nervous system, which is abbreviated as the CNS, and that is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. And then the peripheral nervous system, which is the PNS, and that is the cranial nerves, spinal nerves, the nerves that extend from the spinal cord, and all other nerves in the body. Now, I will spend most of my time today on the central nervous system. Hopefully we'll get to the peripheral nervous system as well. But we spend most of our class topics on the central nervous system as well. Okay, the central nervous system, otherwise known as the brain and the spinal cord. We're going to focus in on the brain right now. When we look at a brain, and obviously this is a drawing, what we see is this surface that looks sort of like, it's sort of bumpy. It has those ridges and it has those valleys. Now those ridges are called gyri, and the plural is, or the singular is gyrus, and the little valleys or indentations, those are called sulci, and the singular of that is sulcus. So the cortex includes all of these gyri and all of these sulci that make up the brain. And this is the outer covering of the brain, or the outer surface of the brain. Does anybody know why it's got so many gyri and sulci? Why is it so bumpy?
It's to increase surface matter.
Yeah,
surface
excellent.
area.
It allows an increase in surface area. So if you were to take the brain and you were to flatten it out completely, it'd be about the size of, if you take a newspaper, if you remember those way back when, and you spread it out, that would be the surface area of the cortex. When I teach in class, I used to have this demonstration where I'd show a little box. I don't know if you guys can see me, I can't see you, but I would show just a little box, and I'd have a big piece of 8.5 by 11 paper. And I'd say, how are we going to get this paper into this little box? Because we have to do this. And somebody would obviously say, well, you crumple it up into a little ball, and then that will help it fit in the box. That's kind of a metaphor for why we have all these little bumps in all these little ridges and sulci, gyri and sulci in the brain, because it allows all that surface area to fit into the box. And this increase in volume and surface area is what makes us uniquely human. The fact that we have so many neurons, and it allows us to have so many other functions, that it's important that we have the space for all that. So the cortex, which earlier neuroanatomists thought this brain, the outside of the brain, looked kind of like tree bark, and that's what cortex means. That is the description of the outer covering of the brain. It's also called the cerebral cortex, and it is that surface of the brain that has all those little ridges and grooves. Each one of these ridges, again, is called a gyrus, and gyri is the plural, and each of the little grooves is called a sulcus, and sulci is the plural. Now, if they're really, really deep, they get promoted to another word, and that's a fissure. It's like a deep sulcus. And there are a couple in the brain that are really important to know, and I'll point them out to you right now. The first one is the central sulcus. Now, it's not been promoted to fissure, but it is still really important. But the central sulcus is really the only sulcus that you'll notice that goes from the very top of the brain all the way down continuously to where this part of the brain sort of juts out. This is called the temporal lobe. It goes all the way down. You'll see the other ones may start out, but they don't quite finish. But this one, it goes all the way from the center top part of the brain all the way down to this other sort of big sulcus. And this one has been promoted to the word fissure. This is the lateral fissure. Okay. And here's the frustrating thing about neuroanatomy is that you'll find that the same structure or the same landmark in the brain can have up to 4 different names. And here's one of them that you'll see used interchangeably sometimes in the literature. This lateral fissure right here is also called the Sylvian fissure. Now, I will refer to it as the lateral fissure, but others refer to it as the Sylvian fissure. These two sulci, fissure in one case, are really important because they help us establish where different lobes in the brain are. Okay, so we need to know where the central sulcus is. We also need to know where the lateral fissure is. Okay, those will become important when we talk about the lobes of the brain. Okay, let's go into a little bit more of the sulci and the gyri. So if we take a transverse cut, a coronal cut, slice of the brain, that allows you to see, just like in that other photo where there was just a little cut out of the brain, you can see where the gray matter, the pinkish gray matter is, and where the white matter is. And you can see that these gyri actually are pretty deep they go up pretty tall, or they're pretty high, and the sulci are actually pretty deep, and that allows, as one very smart person was saying, I wish I could see your face, I don't know who it was, but who said that increases our ability to have surface area. And the more surface area that you are allowed to have in the brain, the more neurons you're allowed to pack in there. So you can see how, even though these are not on the surface of the brain, these are also where the neuron cell bodies and dendrites are. And all of this white matter is where all these neurons and cell bodies are sending their communications, their axons, and we know the axons are there because it has a whitish appearance from the myelin. Okay, now the brain itself is very soft. It's kind of the fresh brain. It's the consistency of Jell-O or soft butter. And if you wanted to, you could actually put your hand right through it, which seems kind of gross. Now, why are the ones in jars so firm, and you can shake the jar and it doesn't disintegrate? It's because they've added a fixative, and that fixative actually firms up the neural tissue. But the fresh brain is actually not like that. The brain that you have in your head is very delicate and very soft. So there are some important ways that the brain has evolved to protect itself. Okay, one of them is the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is not some structure, some thing in the brain. It actually describes a way that the blood supply in the brain is different from the blood supply in other parts of the body. So the walls of your blood vessels they consist of these little cells called endothelial cells, and they pack together and they join together to form a wall. They kind of aggregate to form a wall, the walls of your the blood supply. Now, in the rest of your body, they're packed together, but there's little gaps in between. In the brain, they are packed so tightly, there's hardly any gap there at all. And so what that does, this tight packing of the endothelial cells in the brain's blood supply, it prevents any substances from leaching out of the blood and into the neurons, and anything from the neurons from going back into the blood. Now, the rest of your body, it's not like that. These cells are not packed so closely together. And so that is actually why drugs like that use the patch work, because if you put the patch on your skin absorbs the drug, and then eventually it gets absorbed into the bloodstream through those junctions, because they're not as tightly packed as they are in the brain. So the blood-brain barrier describes this tight organization or tight packing of those cells to prevent any substances from going in and out of the blood supply. Now, things like sugar and oxygen can still go through there, and they do, because your neurons need that to function. But other things, neurotoxins, are prevented for the most part from crossing the blood-brain barrier. Okay, so that when people talk about the blood-brain barrier, that's what they're referring to. They're referring to the way that the blood supply in the brain is very tightly packed. The cells are tightly packed to prevent any substances from transferring across. Okay, there is one part of the brain that does not have this tight junction, and it is a part of the brain that is in the brainstem. It's called the area postrema. Now, the area postrema is the one part of the brain that doesn't have this blood-brain barrier, and it's for a very specific reason, or it's thought to be for a specific reason, and that's that you need to have some part of the brain that's able to keep the lookout for any sort of neurotoxins that might damage the rest of the body and the brain before the brain gets damaged, before it actually shuts down the brain. So here's an example of one that's legal, and that's alcohol. Alcohol is a central nervous system depressant, and what it will do in excess is it will shut down parts of the brainstem. It will stop, and the brainstem is really important, particularly the medulla. It's involved in remembering to make sure that you breathe, and it's involved in keeping your heart beating. So if you take a substance like alcohol in excess, it'll shut down your ability to breathe, and it shuts down your heart, and that's the end of you. So there is this part of the brain, the area postrema, is there to kind of test the blood, test the waters, test the blood supply to make sure that you're not taking in too many toxins that are going to kill you. And what it does is it sort of tastes or senses what's in the blood. And if it senses a neurotoxin, then it initiates the gag reflex so that you will evacuate whatever that is from your stomach that is causing, that is poisoning your brain and threatening it to shut down. So this is why when you drink too much alcohol, for example, you get sick and you vomit, because the area postrema is doing its job to keep you safe. This is also why you need to remember that when you are drinking, that you make sure that you don't drink too much alcohol too fast, because if you drink too much alcohol too fast and it shuts down the central nervous system before the area postrema gets a chance to say, hey, it's too much, we got to get rid of this, then it can cause you to pass out. And if there's too much in your blood supply, and so much that it'll shut down your brain, then that can cause you to die. If the area postrema is able to initiate the gag reflex after someone's passed out, then you could choke on your vomit. So not to be too gross, but just to illustrate why it's really important to make sure that you keep track of your drinking and not drink too much alcohol too fast, so that your brain will not be able to keep up. Okay. Public service announcement over, but that is what the area postrema does. It makes sure that if there is any toxins, then it will help to get rid of that toxin to prevent the brain and the body from dying. What's another way that the brain's protected? Well, another way is that we have the bony skull, and you can see this sort of porous tissue or porous looking thing here. This is skull bone. Okay, and the skull bone, as you can imagine, it's a very good protection for the brain. It's not perfect. I mean, you can get a fractured skull. But underneath the skull bone, you have something called the meninges. And the meninges are 3 layers of protective covering on the brain. And I like to use the acronym PAD. You can use DAP, whatever you would like to use that helps you remember it. But you need to remember that there's these 3 layers, and they differ from each other in what they do. But they encase the central nervous system. In some parts of the central nervous system, there's only 2 layers, but we won't go into that much detail. We need to know that there's 3. The first one, and the one that's closest to the skull, is the dura mater. The dura mater is the toughest. It's flexible. It's the toughest of all 3 anyway. It's not completely impermeable. I mean, a gunshot wound, a stab wound, a lot of those things can penetrate the dura mater, but it is pretty strong. It's the strongest of the 3, and it's the one that's closest to the skull. The next one is the arachnoid, and that's this little green layer here that you can see in the picture. And it also includes all of this sort of spongy kind of tissue. Now, the early neuroanatomists thought, wow, that looks kind of like a spider web. And so hence the name arachnoid, and they called that the arachnoid membrane. Now, it's that spongy tissue because it's porous and it allows fluid to circulate. This is where the cerebral spinal fluid circulates around the brain in the central nervous system. And then the third one is the pia mater. That's this little pink, very delicate layer that lies just next to the cortex, the surface of the cortex. So between the pia mater and the arachnoid layer, okay, we've got this membrane, it's called the subarachnoid space. This is where cerebral spinal fluid is circulating around the brain. But these are the 3 layers, the dura, the arachnoid, and the pia, that encase the brain and protect it. Okay, so here's just another view where you've got the meninges and you've got the bony skull here. We've got the dura mater, it's the thickest, the arachnoid, and then you've got that subarachnoid space. And then finally the pia mater, which is that delicate layer that lies just on top of the cortex. Okay. Moving on to, let's talk about this subarachnoid space a little bit more. The subarachnoid space, as I mentioned, is the place where cerebral spinal fluid flows in the brain. Now, cerebral spinal fluid, if you ever wondered where that came from, it actually is a product, it's produced from the blood. It's produced in the ventricles, and I'll show you the ventricles in more detail in a few minutes. But there's a part of the ventricles that takes the blood supply and then pulls from it. It's almost like plasma, and it creates this clear fluid called cerebral spinal fluid, and it creates a lot of it each day. upwards of 500 milliliters. So you're constantly producing cerebrospinal fluid, and then it circulates. You can see that it's created, it circulates, it goes down into the spinal cord and back up and circulates around the brain. And at some point, it gets reabsorbed into the bloodstream. So one of the things that cerebrospinal fluid does is it circulates to remove toxins like plaques, the kind of plaque that you would see in Alzheimer's disease. And once it circulates and removes those toxins or used up neurotransmitters, the byproducts of neurotransmitters that have been broken down, it gets reabsorbed in the bloodstream and then it gets excreted as waste. So you've got this constant supply of blood that is being produced into cerebrospinal fluid, which then flows around in the central nervous system and then gets reabsorbed into the bloodstream. We'll talk more about cerebrospinal fluid as we go through the semester because it does play a pretty important role. Okay, the next thing I want to mention is the choroid plexus, and that is the factory inside the ventricles that is creating cerebrospinal fluid. So choroid plexus, it's within the ventricles of the brain. It's highly vascular, which means there's a lot of blood supply, and that blood supply is important because that is what cerebrospinal fluid is created from. It's created from the blood. It's that clear sort of fluid that circulates in the subarachnoid space, in the meninges. Okay, one thing I want to show you, and this is an app that I think would be useful to have. I want to show you because I'm going to talk about the ventricles next, but it's really hard to visualize the ventricles with just this two-dimensional space. Let me go ahead and open up my iPad so that it's going to be a little bit easier to see. But let me just tell you about the ventricles now. There are a total of 4. And the first 2 are the lateral ventricles. Now there's not a 1 and a 2. There's just, here's the 2. This could be 1 and that could be 2 or vice versa. But there's the lateral ventricles, and these extend through each of the lobes. So there's one in the left hemisphere and one in the right. And then the next one is the third ventricle that's located in the center of the brain. There's only one of those. And then there is this like irrigation canal called the cerebral aqueduct that carries fluid down into the fourth ventricle. So there's a total of 4 ventricles. The lateral ventricles, there's 2 of those, the third, and then the fourth ventricle. This is all the cerebral aqueduct here. The cerebral aqueduct is what helps, or what carries that fluid throughout the 4 different ventricles. Okay, so this is the side view. This is a sagittal view. Remember, we're talking about the different planes. And this is a transverse view. So you can see how those ventricles sort of extend into the lobes of the brain. Again, here's another sagittal view. But it's really hard to appreciate what these look like, I think, as I was saying, with the 2 dimensions. So let me go ahead and show you another thing. This is an app that you can get. It's called 3D Brain. And 3D Brain allows you to take any of the structures that we're learning about in this class, and it allows you to sort of visualize them and move them around in a 3-dimensional space so you get a better appreciation of just what they look like. Here's what the app looks like. It's this little icon here, 3D Brain. I'm going to click on it. And when you do, you'll see that it's already opened up to the ventricles because I was just showing the last class. But what you do is you can open up the ventricles and then you can rotate the brain. So you can see here we've got the lateral ventricles, right? The left and the right. And then you've got the third ventricle in the middle, and then the cerebral aqueduct, and then the fourth ventricle. So if you've ever wondered, if you want to know what these 3D structures look like that we're looking at in the class, I highly recommend getting the 3D Brain app. I think there's a free version, and then there's a 99-cent high definition version. I think this is the high def version, but it's well worth it if you want a better appreciation of what these structures look like. And there's lots of structures that you can choose from to look at. Here's one of the hippocampus, which we'll learn about when we have the week on learning and memory. The hippocampus is that green structure, and there's one in each hemisphere. Okay. So I just want to give you a different view of the lateral ventricles and share that app with you in case you would like to be able to see these things in a different dimension as well. Now, let's talk about the brain again. So this is a horizontal view okay, because we're looking down at the top of the brain, and you're going to see, here's another really important brain landmark. So we've got the lateral fissure, which is on the lateral part of the brain. That'll help you remember where it is. We have the central sulcus, right? It's the only sulcus that goes from the top of the brain all the way down to the lateral fissure. And then we have the longitudinal fissure, and this goes the longitude of the brain, and it's what really differentiates the left and the right hemispheres. And the two cerebral hemispheres, you'll see they're not really exactly symmetrical. They are very, very similar, but they're not quite symmetrical because they do things slightly differently. Now, they process the same information, but they process it in a different way. You may be familiar with how in most people, the left hemisphere processes language, as the right hemisphere in most people processes more spatial information, not spatial like you're so spatial, but spatial like where things are in space and looking at the big picture of things that you're processing, whereas the left hemisphere looks at specific details and processes things step by step. So they process the same information, they do it a little bit differently, and then they share information through a structure called the corpus callosum. I'll show you that in a minute. Okay, but the cerebral hemispheres, this is what you see when you're looking at a brain. You see cortex, and then you see how the cortex is divided up into the left and the right. And the thing that divides it is this longitudinal fissure that goes from the front pole of the brain all the way to the back, or the occipital pole. It divides the brain in half. And if you were to take some, like your finger or some instrument, and place it in the middle of the longitudinal fissure, you would go down pretty deep until you hit that structure called the corpus callosum that I'll show you in just a few minutes. So these are sort of symmetrical, but they're not mirror images. They're kind of sort of, and they process the information in the world a little differently. And that differs whether you're a righty or a lefty as well. Okay, now I'm going to talk really generally about the 4 lobes of the brain that you need to know. You need to know these 4 lobes. You need to know the functions that are associated with them, and also the primary processing cortices, or the cortex, the primary cortex that goes in each. All right, so the 4 lobes that you need to know are the frontal, the temporal, that's the green here, frontal's the yellow in this picture, the parietal, that's this area back up here in the dorsal part, and then the occipital lobe. These are named because of the bones that are just covering that part of the brain. Oh, one thing I want to mention is if you have a hard time remembering these, then just remember the sentence, Freud took his pants off. If you can remember that, Freud took his pants off, then you'll know frontal for Freud, temporal for took, pants is parietal, and then occipital is off. Okay, so that'll help you remember the 4. And then we have, oops, right down here, we have the cerebellum. We'll talk about that later on in the semester. Okay, what does the frontal lobe do? The frontal lobe in this picture is this whole area in green, but it also includes everything anterior to the central sulcus. Now, the central sulcus is this sulcus right here that goes from the top of the brain all the way down to the lateral fissure. You can see the lateral fissure is denoted in this structure, or in this drawing. And it also, the frontal lobe also includes this little purple gyrus. That is part of the frontal lobe. And that little purple gyrus plays a really important role because it is the primary motor cortex. Okay, and since it's in this gyrus that's just in front of the central sulcus, it's called the precentral gyrus. The primary motor cortex is located in the precentral gyrus. Anytime you are starting to initiate any sort of a movement, this is the part of the brain that comes online because it's helping you to initiate what parts of your body are going to move. All of this is done really outside of our awareness for the most part, but this is the primary motor cortex, and this is the part of the brain that's processing that movement. Now, there are neurons in this precentral gyrus in the primary motor cortex that do specific jobs, and they are dedicated to specific parts of the body. And what you'll find, or what they found, is that parts of the body that are most important in movement, in particular the mouth, because communication is so important in humans. There are a lot of neurons devoted towards the mouth for being able to produce speech and the movements of the face, facial expressions. A lot of neurons are devoted towards that. Also eating. If we don't eat, then we don't survive. So a lot of these neurons are devoted towards the face and the mouth. Similarly, for the feet and the hands, you'll notice that there are, when I show you the diagram in just a few minutes, you'll notice that there is a very definite organization of the parts of the body that get mapped right onto the motor cortex. And the parts of the body that are most important in movement will have more neurons devoted, a higher volume of neurons devoted towards moving that part of the body. You can map your entire body onto the neurons here. So if you could stimulate neurons in a certain part and you would be able to identify that they control movement in a certain part of the body. Again, larger areas, more neurons are devoted towards parts of the body that it's really important for you to move and to move in the right way. So like the mouth, for example. Okay, another part of the frontal lobe, and I just mentioned this function. Another important part is Broca's area. And maybe you remember this from intro psych or from another source. Broca's area is this part of the brain. It's located just adjacent to the primary motor cortex because it does a similar thing, but it's involved in communication and as far as creating the sounds and the movements of the mouth to be able to create speech. It's also involved in grammatical structure, making sure that what we are saying makes sense grammatically and structure-wise, the little details of what we're saying. Now, it is located anterior to the precentral gyrus. Anterior means in front of, and it goes along the lateral fissure here. So the Broca's area extends to the lateral fissure. Okay, this is probably the most important, I think, the most important thing that the frontal lobe does, and that is the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in those behaviors and the functions that make us really uniquely human. And we call those the executive functions. These are our ability to pay attention. These are our ability to not be impulsive, our ability to organize, to plan, to have impulse control, to not do the things that we know are bad for us to do, and to do the things that we know we should be doing. It also is involved in knowing the consequences of our actions. So knowing if you say something mean to somebody out of frustration, this part of the brain is the one that remembers that, oh, when you did that last time, you got in trouble or you lost your job or whatever the negative consequence is. Also, it remembers positive or pleasant consequences too. It is what allows you to remember what happened last time so that you can adjust your behavior this time. So the prefrontal cortex is hugely important. And when you have dysfunction in the prefrontal cortex, then you see a breakdown in these executive functions. People who have concussions that cause damage in the frontal cortex, in the prefrontal cortex, they have a hard time sometimes until the concussion heals, paying attention, being able to focus, being able to be organized and to do planning. So prefrontal cortex dysfunction is not a good thing to have. Okay, so that's the frontal lobe. The next lobe is the parietal lobe. How do we identify that? Well, it's all about the central sulcus again. When we find the central sulcus, we know that that divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe includes everything behind the central sulcus or posterior to the central sulcus. And if this is the precentral gyrus, then this is the postcentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus is where the primary somatosensory cortex is located. So this is the part of the brain that is involved in identifying physical sensations from your body. It's also the part of the brain that is involved in knowing where your body is in space and where your body is moving in space. So that's the primary somatosensory cortex. And just like you can map on your entire body to the neurons in the primary motor cortex, you can also map on your body into the primary somatosensory cortex. And the parts of your body that are most important in being able to feel sensations, those are the ones that they're going to have the most neurons, the most volume dedicated to. So you can imagine that when we're speaking, it's not only important to have a lot of the primary motor cortex involved in moving the mouth, right? But also we need to know what it feels like when our mouth moves certain ways so that we know when to stop movement, right? And that is the somatosensory cortex. It's that feedback into our brain that allows us to know what our body is doing, what our mouth is doing. So there are a lot of neurons in the primary somatosensory cortex that are devoted towards things like speech. So you'll see that the area of the primary somatosensory cortex that controls the mouth or gets sensations from the mouth is pretty big too. Okay, so it's located on the postcentral gyrus. This is all, again, part of the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe, in general, I mentioned, this mapping, let me go back, this mapping of parts of the body onto the different places in these gyri, that's called the homunculus, because what people have done is they've taken the amount of neurons devoted to different body parts and they've created a little like human. So if you look up the definition of homunculus, it means like a miniature small human. When you create a little small human or homunculus that has proportions that are the same as the number of neurons in each of these gyri, you get this really misshapen, weird looking creature that has a huge head and a huge mouth, right? Because those are really important and there's a lot of neurons devoted towards those. Some people have said it looks sort of demonic. It's kind of strange. But if you go on the website, I think there's a picture of the two homunculi. There's one for the motor cortex and one for the somatosensory cortex. But again, the primary somatosensory cortex, it receives information about your body senses, where you are in space, position, and movement. Okay. The rest of the parietal lobe does a lot of other stuff. Mostly what it's doing is processing the spatial location of your body, of sounds, of where you are in space, where things are in space. It does a lot of spatial processing. And when you have damage in that area, you see people that have deficits in being able to process things in space. There's something called hemi-neglect, which is associated with damage in the right posterior parietal lobe. And that is when the person is just completely unaware of anything in the left side of space. If you were to say, hey, what's going on over here on this right, on the left side of space, because we have that ipsilateral hookup, they would not be aware of it until you tell them to look, and then they'd be able to identify it. It's just not something that's on their radar because that part of the brain, the right posterior hemisphere, is involved in making sure that you're aware of everything in your environment. If you were to give somebody with hemi-neglect a clock face, like a round clock, just a circle, and say, draw a clock, a person without hemi-neglect would draw all the numbers, 1 through 12, and then they'd put the clock hands. The person with hemi-neglect would only draw the right side of the clock. So you'd have numbers 12 through 6, but then everything on the left side of the clock would be blank. But if you said, hey, what about the other side of the clock? They would think, oh, okay. And then they draw it in. So it's not that they're not able to produce or know what should be on the left side of space. They just don't do it because that's what the parietal lobe does. It helps you to identify and pay attention to things in space. Okay. Here is a picture of the homunculi. This is the mapping of different body parts onto these gyri. Here's the primary somatosensory cortex. Here's the primary motor cortex. And you can see for the somatosensory, there are a lot of neurons that are devoted towards being able to sense where your mouth is in space, what it's feeling, what it's sensing, as there are in the primary motor cortex. There's a lot of neurons that are devoted towards movement of your mouth and your lips and your face, for example. But you can map your entire body onto these two gyri. Okay, moving on to the next one, and that is the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe, if you can find the lateral fissure, then you have found the temporal lobe, because it is this entire structure here that sort of juts out. Now, the problem with the temporal lobe, and it's very similar to the parietal, is that there's really no clear line of demarcation as far as where the parietal lobe ends and where the temporal lobe ends. It's kind of a hazy thing here. But for the rest of the temporal lobe, it's really bounded by the lateral fissure. Now, the temporal lobe does a couple really important things, but one of them is that it processes auditory information. So it contains the primary auditory cortex. That's this little area here in pink. That's where information that is auditory is processed first in the brain, and then it goes to other places. This is the primary cortex. After processing auditory information here, then it gets sent out to other parts of the brain. We call those association cortex or association cortices. So here's the primary motor, here's the primary somatosensory, here is the primary auditory cortex. So it receives information from the ears, and it processes not only things like language, but music and any other sort of sounds. Now, it says receive sensory information from the ears. That's not exactly true, because all sensory information except for olfactory, which is smell, goes through another structure called the thalamus. That's a subcortical structure that I will talk about, hopefully, if we have time in a few minutes. Okay, the other main thing that the temporal lobe does is it's involved in memory, and it's really the inferior part here, right? The lower part that's involved in that. Anytime you are identifying an object or a thing or even a person, that's more inferior, but those are memory. Those involve things like the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is located on the internal or the medial part of the temporal lobe. I don't know if you can hear that. My cat is just dying to get in here. So, but I've got to get through this, so she'll be fine. Okay, so the temporal lobe does not only primary auditory cortex, but it also is involved in the identification of objects and people. So memory. The last one is the occipital lobe. And the occipital lobe is located in the posterior part of the brain, the most posterior part. It contains the primary visual cortex because it processes visual information. When visual information from our environment comes through, goes to the thalamus first, and then first place it goes is the primary visual cortex, where it begins processing. Now, there's lots of processing that happens after that, but the first place, the primary place, is the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe. Okay, I mentioned the corpus callosum before. Remember, it is that structure. Here is a sagittal view where you can see clearly the corpus callosum. You can see where it's been actually cut. It connects the left and the right hemisphere, and it's got a whitish sort of appearance. If you were to see it, it's whitish because it contains the axons, right? Remember the myelination, the myelin sheath, that lipid fatty structure? Because the corpus callosum is a huge information superhighway that connects the left hemisphere with the right hemisphere so they can share information. That sharing of the information helps us to get a better idea of whatever it is that we're processing in our environment. So really the corpus callosum is this structure right here, this whitish or lightish structure, and it connects the two hemispheres of the brain, homologous parts. So the temporal lobe on the right hemisphere is connected with the temporal lobe on the left hemisphere, and et cetera. Okay. And this is a bunch of axons. You know, interesting, there was a lot of research probably a couple decades ago, where they found that the corpus callosi of women is much bigger than for men. And they thought, well, maybe that's why women are so intuitive. But then when they did a further investigation, they noticed that, yes, it's bigger for women, but it's denser for men. And what I mean by that is not that men are dense, but that the amount of axons are crammed in a much smaller space. So really, women and men have the same connections. It's just they differed a little bit in what they looked like. So doesn't explain why women are more intuitive. Okay, so we've gone over the cortex, the cortical structures. Now we're going to talk about the subcortical region. So the cortex is that outer covering of the brain. The subcortical regions are what we're talking about now, and I'm just going to talk about them very generally. We will go into detail on them later in the semester. But the structures that you need to know are those that are located in the brain, but they're beneath the cortex. They're beneath the cerebral cortex. And they include the limbic system, which really isn't a system, but a grouping of structures that do a similar thing. In this case, they are involved in emotion. The basal ganglia, again, a grouping of structures that are involved in movement, particularly voluntary movement. And then lastly, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Now, I mentioned the thalamus before because it is where all incoming sensory information goes first, and then it's sent to the primary processing areas. But I'll also briefly tell you about the hypothalamus. Let's see if I can do this in 4 minutes. Okay. The limbic system, these are, again, it's not a system, but these are structures in the brain that are involved in the processing of emotion and the expression and the experience of emotion. Now, one thing that should be included here is the frontal lobes, because we know the frontal lobes are involved in emotion as well. And many people who study emotion agree that the frontal lobes are part of the limbic system structures. The basal ganglia, a group of structures that are involved in voluntary movement. In movement disorders like Parkinson's, for example, this is what starts to break down and that causes difficulties with movement. So the basal ganglia are involved in voluntary movement. The last is the thalamus. That's these two little kind of bluish egg-shaped structures. There's two thalami, one in the left hemisphere, one in the right. And again, this is the place where all incoming sensory information, other than olfactory, comes in and then is sent to the other parts of the brain for processing. It's called thalamus because thalamus really means anteroom. So it's like the front room, you know, the hallway when you go into a house, that area that you have to go in that front room before you're sent to the room that you need to go to. That's kind of like the thalamus. It is the place where all incoming sensory information goes before it gets sent to other parts. The hypothalamus plays a really, really important role, even though it's tiny, and hypo means sub or below. It's this little structure right below here. There are two actually. But one of the things that you can use to help you remember it is that the hypothalamus is involved in the 4 Fs, okay? Feeding, fighting, fleeing, and reproduction or fornication or whatever you want to substitute in there. It actually does more than that, but that helps you kind of remember what it does. It's really involved in something called homeostasis, which is a huge theme in this class. And it's your tendency for your body to try and keep your body in optimal processing mode. Okay, so it identifies when you're hungry so that you know to eat. It identifies when you're too cold, so it starts you to shiver or gets you to go feel cold so that you'll put on more clothing. But the hypothalamus is really important. It's also involved in the fight or flight reflex. But that is the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Okay, still have a little bit more time. Great. Let's talk about the brainstem, also known as the hindbrain. So we have the cortex here, we have subcortical structures, and then we have the brainstem. And the brainstem is composed of 3 main structures: the pons, and that is this little bump here. It actually means bridge because it was thought to bridge this part of the brain, the medulla, with the rest of the brain. And it's involved in lots of things, including your sleeping, being awake, that not sexual arousal necessarily, but with being awake and alert and paying attention. It's also part of the reticular formation, which is involved in allowing you to pay attention and process incoming stimuli and not be overwhelmed or be overwhelmed. The second part of the brainstem is the medulla. And I mentioned the medulla before because remember, it does those really important things like helping us remember to breathe and keeping our heart beating. We could call those vegetative functions. That's what the medulla does. It's the lowest part of the hindbrain here. And it's involved in, like I said, essential things like remembering to breathe. And then the last part is the cerebellum, which is the little brain. And that's the one that I said you should look for when you're trying to figure out which hemisphere of the brain that you're looking at. It is probably the second most recognizable feature after the cortex. And it does a lot of stuff that we're just finding out. Its role in brain processing has really elevated in the last few years because it can be involved in lots of things, including not only movement, but even memory. It's also involved in coordination and being able to maintain direction and intensity. It's also involved in learning motor skills. Okay, let's see. I'm on my last minute just to show you the pons. Again, is this little kind of eggy shaped structure. It means bridge. The medulla is the top or the lowest part of the brain in the brainstem. And then last we have the cerebellum. Okay, so the peripheral nervous system is the other part of the nervous system other than the central, and it consists of lots of things, including all of those nerves that allow us to move when we want to move and to experience different sensations in the body, and also the cranial nerves. You can divide the peripheral nervous system by function as well. So we have the somatic or the sensory nerves and the motor nerves. And then we also have the autonomic, and that is the part of the peripheral nervous system that's involved in emotional response like the fight or flight response. It prepares your body to respond to things that are stressful or highly emotional. And then the other part is so that's the sympathetic nervous system. And the other part, the parasympathetic, is what allows us to relax and restore to prepare for the next time that we have to have an autonomic nervous system response. Here is a diagram of the structure of the peripheral nervous system. You can divide it into the somatic. Again, that's the cranial nerves, which I'll show you in a moment, and the spinal nerves, which include the motor neurons and also the sensory neurons that allow us to get somatosensory information from the environment. The other part of the peripheral nervous system, as I mentioned in the last slide, is the autonomic nervous system, and that's involved in our fight or flight response. And it includes both the sympathetic, which is the fight and flight part, and the parasympathetic, which is the part of the autonomic nervous system that allows our bodies to restore and rest and recuperate for the next time we have to activate that fight or flight system. So just in a little bit more detail, the somatic nervous system, again, includes the spinal nerves, which are motor neurons. Those operate the skeletal muscles to allow us to move, to walk, to sit. And we could refer to those as efferent because they are sending information from the brain out to the body, and they allow us to cause an effect to our environment. The other part is the sensory neurons, and they bring information about the senses and the sensory environment around us into the brain, and they arrive from the external environment. They arrive into the brain. So they're afferent neurons. A stands for arrive, or A begins the word arrive, and A begins the word afferent. So that's the difference between efferent, which causes an effect, and motor neurons cause us to move, to cause an effect in our environment, whereas sensory neurons bring the information from the environment into the brain where it arrives so we can process it, and that's afferent neurons. Starts with an A, and so does arrive. If that helps you remember that. The other part of the somatic nervous system is the cranial nerves, and the cranial nerves are separate from the somatic nerves. And these refer to nerves that innervate different parts of our face. They all have different functions. These are not something that you have to memorize for this class, but I just want you to be aware of the cranial nerves. And in fact, there's another cranial nerve that is debated right now. So far, there are, I believe, 12. But it's thought that there might be an additional one, a 13th. We'll talk about that later in the semester. Let's talk a little bit more about the peripheral nervous system part or a specific part of the peripheral nervous system called the autonomic nervous system. Again, this is your fight or flight system. It's divided into two parts, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. It regulates, not only is it involved in the fight or flight, but it also regulates general activity levels in the body, because most of your organs, smooth muscle, stomach, blood vessels, all of those things are innervated by the autonomic nervous system, including the heart and the digestive system. Now, these are totally separate systems. The sympathetic and the autonomic often have opposite effects on the parts of the body that they innervate. So the sympathetic nervous system, again, that's the part that activates the fight or flight system, whereas the parasympathetic is the part that when it's active, it activates the relaxation and the restoring of the nervous system so that you're prepared if you have to respond in a fight or flight situation next time. Both of these aspects of the autonomic nervous system innervate different parts of the body, and often they have opposite effects. So, for example, if you have the sympathetic nervous system that activates an increase in heart rate, when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, it causes your heart rate to increase. Now, if the parasympathetic nervous system is activated, it causes your heart rate to decrease. So they often have opposite effects. How can you remember the difference between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic? Well, hopefully this will help. Sympathetic starts with an S, and so does this little creature here. If you remember, his name is Scrat. So Scrat and sympathetic. Scrat was a very nervous, anxious little character. and he was constantly hyper aroused, very energetic, moved around very quickly. When your sympathetic nervous system is activated, you have a higher increase, or you have an increase in your general arousal. You expend more energy because when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, then it's preparing your body to respond to some sort of a threat. And so it activates the body in a way that helps it to cope with whatever that threat is, whether it's an emotional, stressful threat or a physical threat. Maybe you walk out in the middle of the street and you're texting and you don't realize that you walked out in front of a car. All of a sudden you look up, or you hear the horn, and it activates your sympathetic nervous system to activate you to move out of the way of that car. That's an example of activation of the sympathetic nervous system. Click on the link and you can see a little video that shows how Scrat is, and he is very clearly an example of an overactivated sympathetic nervous system. So Scrat starts with an S, and sympathetic nervous system also starts with an S. Okay, what about the parasympathetic nervous system? The parasympathetic nervous system, when it becomes active, it actually slows the activity to help your body restore and recuperate and rest for the next time you might have to respond to some sort of an emotional or physical threat. So when it is active, it slows the activity of your organs, and it may seem counterintuitive, but it is activated when you are relaxing. It stimulates digestion so that you're able to take the nutrients from your food to get more energy, and it helps you to prepare for the next time when you have to face any sort of a threat. Now, I think about the typical panda bear that moves very slowly and very calmly. And panda starts with a P, and parasympathetic also starts with a P. Now, don't think of Kung Fu Panda, because then that'll screw up the metaphor. But if this helps you, panda starts with a P, and pandas are very slow. And parasympathetic also starts with a P. So that is the end of the basic neuroanatomy lecture. We'll go into the details of these different structures and systems as we continue on through the semester, but I just wanted to give you a quick overview of those parts of the nervous system so that you are prepared when we start talking about them in the future. And that's it.